The wild is unforgiving. But no one expected what this gray wolf would do after being saved. Alone, freezing, and too weak to escape, his fate seemed sealed. But when a group of loggers found him, they faced an impossible decision. And what happened next was simply extraordinary. Get ready for a heart-stopping story of survival, courage, and an act of gratitude that no one saw coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories like this one. The wind howled through the towering pines, sweeping across the frozen lake like a ghostly whisper. The sun had barely risen, casting a dull silver light over the endless stretch of white. Snow crunched under the weight of unseen creatures. But the wilderness remained eerily still. In the middle of the vast frozen lake, a gray wolf struggled against the merciless cold. His powerful body, built for endurance and survival, was now betraying him. His front legs were submerged in the frigid water, his thick fur already heavy with ice. Every movement was slower than the last, every breath more labored. He had been running, perhaps chasing prey, perhaps fleeing from something more dangerous, when the ice beneath him had given way. His instincts had screamed at him to retreat, but it had happened too fast. One moment he was bounding across the frozen expanse, the next he was sinking. He had fought at first, his claws scraping against the slick ice, his muscles burning with effort. But the more he struggled, the more the ice cracked, widening the gaping hole that threatened to swallow him whole. He had stopped trying to lunge forward and instead clung to the jagged edges with everything he had. Now, after what felt like hours, his strength was failing. His golden eyes, sharp and intelligent, flickered with desperation. He let out a hoarse, broken howl, but it barely carried in the wind. He was too cold, too tired. The forest was supposed to be his home, but at this moment it felt like his grave. In the distance, the low rumble of engines broke the silence. A few miles away, 3 loggers were heading toward their next job site. Mike, the eldest of the 3, sat in the front seat of the truck, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. His thick beard was speckled with frost, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Next to him, Carter, younger but just as tough, tightened his coat. In the back seat, Dave leaned forward, frowning. "Did you hear that?" Mike slowed the truck, listening. The engine hummed, but beyond that, the forest was silent. Then, a faint, haunting sound, a howl, but not just any howl. It was weak, almost desperate. Carter narrowed his eyes. "That's not a normal call." Mike hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Let's check it out." Their truck rumbled forward, its tires crunching over the icy road. None of them knew it yet, but what they were about to find on that frozen lake would be something they'd never forget. Mike pulled the truck to a stop at the edge of the tree line. The 3 loggers stepped out into the bitter cold, their boots crunching against the packed snow. The forest was eerily silent, aside from the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. Dave scanned the frozen landscape. "Where did that howl come from?" Carter pointed toward the lake. "Over there, look at the ice." 100 yards ahead, a dark shape stood out against the stark white. At first, it was hard to tell what it was, but as they stepped closer, their breaths caught in their throats. A gray wolf, large and powerful, even in distress, was trapped in the ice. His front legs had broken through the surface, and his chest was partially submerged in the frigid water. Ice clung to his fur, his body trembling from the cold. He lifted his head slightly, golden eyes flickering with exhaustion. "Jesus," Mike muttered. "He's barely hanging on." Carter exhaled sharply. "He's not gonna last much longer. That water will kill him before anything else does." Dave shifted uncomfortably. "You sure we should be getting involved? It's a wild animal." Mike hesitated. It wasn't an easy decision. They all knew the risks. Wolves were predators, dangerous and unpredictable, and yet something about this situation felt different. This wasn't just any wolf. This was a living creature staring death in the face. The wolf let out a weak whimper, his ears barely twitching at their presence. He wasn't baring his teeth, wasn't growling. He was simply pleading. Mike made up his mind. "If we don't help him, he's dead," he said firmly. "We can figure the rest out later." Dave sighed, but nodded, knowing there was no turning back now. The ice was thin and treacherous near the hole where the wolf had fallen. If any of them got too close, they could end up in the same deadly situation. They needed a plan. Mike scanned the truck bed. Rope. We tie it around someone an inch forward. If the ice breaks, we pull them back. Carter nodded. I'll go. Without hesitation, he grabbed a length of rope and secured it around his waist. Dave and Mike braced themselves, anchoring the other end around a sturdy tree. Carter took his first step onto the ice. It groaned under his weight, cracks spiderwebbing outward. He moved slowly, keeping his eyes locked on the wolf. Easy, Mike warned. That ice isn't going to hold forever. The wolf's ears twitched, his gaze meeting Carter's. He was still shivering, his breaths ragged. Carter felt his heart tighten. Hang in there, buddy, he murmured. Carter was 10 feet away when the wolf tried to move. He shifted slightly as if sensing help was near. The movement caused the ice beneath him to shift, and suddenly he slipped deeper into the water. A sharp, pained whimper broke through the frozen air. Shit, he's going under, Dave shouted. Carter lunged forward, reaching out desperately. His glove barely brushed the wolf's fur before the ice beneath him gave way. A crack like a gunshot echoed through the forest. Carter plunged chest deep into the icy water. Pull him back, Mike bellowed. Dave tightened his grip on the rope, bracing himself. Carter gasped at the shock of the cold, but refused to panic. He reached again, this time gripping the thick fur at the wolf's scruff. The wolf did not fight him. For a split second, they just stared at each other. Carter could see the exhaustion in the animal's eyes, the silent plea to keep fighting. Got him, Carter yelled, wrapping an arm around the wolf's torso. Mike and Dave pulled with everything they had. The ice groaned under the strain, but inch by inch, they dragged Carter and the wolf out of the water. Finally, Carter rolled onto solid ice, gasping for breath. The wolf collapsed beside him, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. Come on, let's get him to the truck before he freezes solid, Mike shouted. The men rushed to lift the wolf, carefully wrapping him in one of their thick jackets. He didn't resist. His body was too cold, too weak. As they carried him toward the truck, Carter glanced down at the animal in his arms. The wolf was still watching him, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Gratitude. The truck's engine roared to life, sending puffs of smoke into the frozen air. Inside the cab, Carter sat shivering, his clothes soaked from the ice-cold water, but he wasn't thinking about himself. His eyes were locked on the wolf, now curled up in the thick blanket they had wrapped around him. The animal was barely moving. His fur was soaked, his breaths shallow. If they didn't act fast, he wouldn't make it. Mike turned up the heat, the vents blasting warm air. We need to get him dry, fast. Hypothermia is already setting in. Carter nodded and carefully adjusted the blanket around the wolf, making sure his soaked fur wasn't exposed to the cold air outside. Dave watched with cautious eyes. Are we sure this is a good idea? What if he wakes up and attacks? Carter exhaled, still feeling the weight of the moment when he had pulled the wolf from the lake. The animal hadn't fought him then. He hadn't bared his teeth, hadn't struggled. He had simply trusted. He won't, Carter said quietly. Not now. The truck rumbled over the snow-covered road as they made their way toward their worksite. It was the only shelter they had nearby, a small logging cabin with a wood stove that could bring the wolf's temperature back up. Mike glanced at Carter. You sure about this? Once we bring him inside, we're committed. Carter met his gaze. We already are. The cabin was small but sturdy, built to withstand the harsh winters. As soon as they parked, the men rushed inside, lighting the stove and gathering extra blankets. Carter and Mike carefully carried the wolf inside, laying him down near the heat. The warmth slowly filled the space, melting the ice clinging to his fur. His body was still trembling, but at least he was breathing. Is he going to make it? Dave asked, arms crossed. Mike sighed. I don't know, but we gave him a chance. For a while, the three men just sat there, watching the wolf. The crackling fire was the only sound in the cabin. Then Carter noticed something. The wolf was watching them too. His golden eyes weren't wild or fearful. They were calm, aware. He knew they had saved him. Hours passed. The wolf's shivering slowly faded, and his breathing became steadier. He was still weak, but he was alive. Carter sat nearby, keeping an eye on him. Dave and Mike were at the table, drinking coffee, their conversation low but filled with curiosity. "You ever hear of a wolf thanking someone?" Dave muttered. Mike chuckled. "No, but I also never thought I'd see one in our cabin, wrapped in a damn blanket." Carter smirked, but his expression softened as he looked back at the wolf. He had no idea what the animal was thinking, but one thing was clear. He wasn't trying to run. In fact, he was still watching Carter. Then, to everyone's shock, the wolf moved. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his head. Carter tensed, but not out of fear, out of sheer disbelief. The wolf didn't growl. He didn't snap his jaws. Instead, he nudged Carter's hand with his nose. A hush fell over the cabin. Carter swallowed hard. He barely moved, letting the moment sink in. The wolf had just done something no one expected. He had thanked them. The morning light filtered through the frosted window of the cabin, casting a soft glow over the wooden floor. The fire had burned low, but the warmth still filled the small space. The wolf was awake. Carter noticed it first. He had fallen asleep near the stove, his body still exhausted from the events of the day before. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the wolf watching him. The animal was lying on his side, his fur still damp in places, but he was no longer shivering. His golden eyes were alert, steady, and for the first time since they'd found him, he moved, shifting his front paws, testing his strength. Mike and Dave stirred as Carter slowly sat up. "He's awake," Carter murmured. Mike rubbed his face, his voice still groggy, "and not trying to tear us apart. That's a good sign." Dave exhaled, shaking his head. "I still can't believe we have a wolf in here." Carter ignored them, his attention still on the wolf. Something was different. The wild, panicked energy from before was gone. Instead, the animal seemed thoughtful. He sniffed the air, lifting his head slightly, his ears twitching at the crackling of the fire. And then slowly, he pushed himself up. The three men tensed as the wolf rose to his feet. His legs were still weak, but he stood tall, shaking out his thick fur. Water droplets scattered across the wooden floor. Carter's heart pounded. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Would he lash out, try to escape? Instead, the wolf simply turned his head and looked at Carter. There was no fear in his eyes, no aggression, just an understanding, a quiet acknowledgement. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, the wolf took a slow, careful step forward. The men watched in stunned silence as the wolf walked toward the door. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicking. He was deciding. Carter stood up, his movements careful. "Mike, open the door." Mike hesitated but nodded, stepping forward and unlatching the door. Cold air rushed inside, swirling snowflakes through the doorway. Outside, the wilderness stretched before them, a vast, untouched world of freedom. The wolf stopped at the threshold. He didn't run. He simply stood there, his nose twitching as he breathed in the crisp morning air. Carter felt something tighten in his chest. This was it. The wolf was going to leave, and that was what was supposed to happen, right? The men had saved him, given him a chance to live, but he was a wild animal. He didn't belong here. He belonged out there. The wolf took a step forward onto the snow, then another. His paws pressed into the soft white powder, and for a second, it looked as though he would disappear into the trees. But just before he did, he stopped. And then, slowly, he turned back towards them. Carter held his breath. The wolf's golden eyes met his, and then, to everyone's shock, he lowered his head, not in submission, in gratitude, the same way wolves acknowledge the ones they trust. Carter swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling deep inside him. This wasn't just an animal they had saved. This was something more. A bond had been formed. A moment later, the wolf turned and disappeared into the trees. Carter exhaled slowly, watching him go. Dave let out a low whistle. "Did that just happen?" Mike shook his head. "I think that wolf just told us thank you." Carter said nothing, because deep down he knew it was true. 2 days had passed since the wolf disappeared into the wild. Carter found himself staring at the tree line more than he wanted to admit. Every time the wind rustled the branches, Every time he saw fresh paw prints in the snow near camp, his thoughts returned to the gray wolf. "He's not coming back, you know," Dave muttered, noticing Carter's distant gaze. Carter shrugged, pretending it didn't matter. "Didn't expect him to." Mike scoffed as he threw another log into the stove. "Uh-huh. That why you've been looking out the window like a lost puppy?" Carter shot him a glare, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over. Then, on the third night, something happened. The men had just finished dinner and were settling in when a low, guttural growl echoed outside the cabin. Carter froze. "That wasn't the wind," Dave muttered, reaching for his flashlight. Mike grabbed his rifle out of instinct, but Carter shook his head. "Wait." They moved cautiously to the window, peering out into the moonlit snow. At first, they saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved between the trees. A familiar silhouette emerged from the darkness. The wolf. But he wasn't alone. Carter's breath caught as he stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The others followed, hesitant but curious. The wolf stood a few yards away, his golden eyes reflecting the porch light. He was wounded. A fresh gash ran along his shoulder, staining his fur with streaks of blood. But he wasn't there for himself. Behind him, partially obscured by the trees, was another wolf, a smaller one, a pup. The young wolf barely moved, his thin body trembling from either fear or exhaustion. His coat was dusted with frost, his ribs faintly visible beneath his fur. Carter's heart pounded. This wolf, the one they had saved, had come back, but not for himself. He had come back for help. Mike was the first to speak. "You've got to be kidding me." Dave let out a low whistle. "He brought us his pup?" Carter didn't answer. He was too focused on the way the wolf was looking at him. There was no growling, no aggression, just trust. Pure, undeniable trust. The wolf lowered his head slightly, just like he had the day he left. A silent message. Carter swallowed hard and took a slow step forward. The wolf didn't move. Then, cautiously, Carter knelt down. The pup, too weak to resist, barely reacted as Carter carefully scooped him up into his arms. His fur was freezing, his small body shivering violently. Carter glanced at the gray wolf. "You saved him once," he murmured. "Now it's our turn." For the first time, the wolf let out a low, soft whine, and Carter knew, without a doubt, this was no longer just a wild animal. This was family. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling steadily in the wood stove. The pup lay wrapped in blankets, his small body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. He was weak, but alive. Carter sat beside him, gently rubbing warmth back into the pup's tiny frame. The gray wolf stood at the doorway, watching. Mike and Dave had barely spoken since they brought the pup inside. The situation defied all logic. Wolves weren't supposed to trust humans. They weren't supposed to ask for help. And yet here they were. Carter finally turned toward the wolf. "He's going to make it." The wolf didn't move at first. He simply stood there, framed by the cold outside air, his golden eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Mike tensed. "Careful." But Carter already knew. The wolf wasn't here to attack. He was here for his pup. The pup stirred at the sound of the wolf's soft, throaty whine. His little eyes blinked open, and despite his exhaustion, his tail gave a weak, hopeful wag. Carter carefully unwrapped the blankets and let the pup get closer to his guardian. The wolf lowered his massive head and gently nudged the pup's side with his nose. Carter swore he saw relief in his eyes. An hour passed before the pup finally gathered enough strength to stand. His legs wobbled, but he pressed against the warmth of the gray wolf's side. Carter exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. It was time. Mike opened the door, and once again the cold wind swept inside. The snow outside had settled, the forest eerily calm beneath the moonlight. The wolf looked at Carter one last time. This time there was no hesitation, no fear, only trust. Carter swallowed against the lump forming in his throat. "Take care of him, all right?" The wolf held his gaze for a long moment. Then, to everyone's complete shock, he did something that none of them would ever forget. He stepped forward and pressed his forehead lightly against Carter's hand. A gesture so small, yet so powerful. It wasn't just trust, it was gratitude. Carter's fingers barely moved, not wanting to break the moment. His breath hitched as he realized something deep in his bones. This wasn't just an animal. This was a life he had saved, a bond he had earned. Then, just as quickly, the wolf stepped back. He turned, guiding the pup toward the open world once more. Carter watched them disappear into the trees, and this time, he didn't feel like he was losing something. He felt like he had gained something greater than he could explain, a moment that would stay with him forever. Some connections can't be explained. Some moments change us forever. This wasn't just a story about survival. It was a story about trust, gratitude, and a bond that defied the rules of nature. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who believes in the power of kindness. Let's keep spreading stories that remind us that compassion has no limits.